The Vikings were firmly entrenched in notoriety. It is believed that the northern barbarians, wielding rusty axes and clubs, indiscriminately attacked settlements, raped women, destroyed churches, and made bloody sacrifices in the name of Odin. Over the centuries, the image of the Vikings has acquired fantastic speculation. Someone, for example, believes that the battlefield turned into bears. Let's try to figure out what the Vikings really were. In many feature films and cartoons, the Vikings are shown as dirty and wild men and women, but in fact they cared about their appearance. Combs, tweezers, razors are the most common finds during excavations of Viking settlements. Also found were the remains of soap, which the Vikings made on their own. In England, the Vikings, on the contrary, were considered clean, because they bathed once a week, on Saturday. In the Scandinavian languages, the word Saturday still means bath day, although the descendants of the Vikings themselves do not think about it at all. Vikings in films are also shown as massive, with long blonde hair. Interestingly, an analysis of historical records and excavation data showed that the average height of blondes was about 170 centimeters, which is quite a bit even by ancient standards. With blonde hair, the situation is more interesting. They were considered ideal among the Vikings, but not everyone had light hair. To correct this misunderstanding, a special bleaching soap was used. The Vikings were also hospitable people, and many foreigners joined the Viking tribes, so that among them were Italians, Spaniards, Portuguese, French and even Russians. It is clear that they all had different weight and height characteristics and hair color. Drakkar is a multifunctional ship, adapted not only for sea battles. Its design made it possible to carry heavy loads and go on long voyages. The textbook image of a drakkar, striped sails and round shields attached to the sides, is also inaccurate. If the sides were indeed a common place to store shields, then there is no reliable evidence about the striping of the sails. Another feature of cinematic Vikings is the use of crude, inept weapons like clubs and axes, or none at all. In fact, the Vikings were good weaponsmiths, and using compound forging technology, the same used in the manufacture of Damascus blades, they were able to make very strong and sharp weapons. According to Viking folklore, to test the sharpness of the sword, he dipped into a running stream, and a hair was let through it. If the hair was cut, the sword was considered sharp enough. The source of this legend is the work of a certain Olworm Reuner SCU Danica Literature Antiquissima of 1636, where he wrote that Danish warriors drink from crooked skulls. With a further translation into Latin, only the word skulls remained from the phrase. In addition, during excavations, not a single goblet made from a skull has yet been found. As a result of previous misconceptions, the opinion appeared that the Vikings were unwanted guests everywhere, outcasts. They were allegedly hated by everyone. In fact, they were not only hated, but also respected. The French King Charles III, known as Charles the Simple, gave the Vikings land in the territory of modern Normandy, and married his daughter to one of the Viking leaders Rollo. These domesticated Vikings later repeatedly defended the territory of France from the encroachments of other Vikings. In Constantinople, the Vikings were respected for their strength and courage, so a special Varangian guard consisting of Swedish Vikings was assigned to the Byzantine emperors. The Vikings originated in Scandinavia, but eventually spread throughout the world, reaching North Africa, Russia, and even North America. There are several theories explaining the reasons for the expansion. The most logical of them is related to the depletion of land resources and the increase in the population of Scandinavia, which made it necessary to look for new places to live. Another reason is the depletion of the proceeds from trade between Western Europe and Asia after the fall of the Roman Empire, after which the Vikings had to look for new profitable places. The main occupation of the ancient Scandinavians was by no means robbery attacks on neighbors, but farming and trade. They sold not only raw hides and wood, but also furs, whalebone, weapons and jewelry. In addition, the Scandinavians raised cattle and grew grain on small farms. At times they went to war, and where they visited, in fact, there were ashes. But more often the Vikings went on ships to unfamiliar lands, where they rebuilt new settlements. Northern warriors founded many major cities, including Reykjavik, Dublin and Limerick. And traces of the most remote Scandinavian villages were found on the island of Newfoundland off the coast of North America. The basis of Scandinavian society was made up of peaceful peasants, not cruel bandits. Even in everyday life, the Vikings rarely resorted to corporal punishment, and the most severe punishment was exile. A person was outlawed and sentenced to a hermit life in the fields and forests. No wonder the Norwegian word skagangr, outlawing, literally means hike into the forest, away from people. A very small part of the Vikings were warriors, the rest were engaged in agriculture, crafts and animal husbandry. For sea expeditions, robbery was one of the bonuses that no one refused, not only the Vikings. Most of the Vikings lived peacefully in the lands where Iceland and Greenland are now located and were considered sophisticated traders who dealt with representatives of different nationalities and countries of the world. Contrary to popular belief, the Vikings are not an ethnic group living in the romantic Scandinavian fjords, but a profession. The word Viking itself comes from an Old Norse word meaning a person participating in a campaign to the sea. And Scandinavia is, of course, not a separate country, but a historical and cultural region located on the Scandinavian peninsula. Traditionally, Scandinavia covers the territories of Norway, Sweden and Denmark, but sometimes it also includes other northern countries, Iceland, Finland and the lands of the North Atlantic. This is probably the biggest misconception. So far, no evidence, archaeological or written, has been found that the Vikings wore helmets with horns. All found helmets do not have horns and their design does not provide for such excesses. Most likely, this delusion was supported by the ancient Christians, who considered the Vikings to be the accomplices of the devil, so they were supposed to wear horns on their helmets to intimidate. The Norwegian god Thor had wings on his helmet, which, with a certain amount of imagination, could be mistaken for horns. Also, this myth could appear in the 19th century. The props of Richard Wagner's opera Der Ring de Nibelungen in 1876 are to blame. On the day of the premiere, the character Hunding entered the stage wearing a horned helmet. The image was so remembered by the audience that since then it has been firmly associated with Nordic mythology. There is no historical evidence of such equipment, and in a military campaign, such a frightening luxury is not very practical. Popular myths about the Vikings have long been debunked by historians, but images of warlike northerners in horned helmets still attract authors of books, films and games. Yes, and the fantasy turned out to be so plausible that you involuntarily believe in the power of the legendary Thor's hammer, and in the fortune-telling of the Bear Man.